In this section, we're looking at the brain and central nervous system. The brain is made out of 4 major parts. So we have the cerebrum, which is this area right here. We have the diencephalon, which is in this area. We have the brain stem and the cerebellum. When you look at a section of the brain, you see that the outside is made out of gray matter, and gray matter is where we find cell bodies and very short unmyelinated neurons. We see white matter on the inside, and when the white matter is made out of axons that are both myelinated and unmyelinated. I also want to give you the terms for the bumps and the kind of crevices that we see. So a bump is a gyrus, and a crevice is a sulcus. A really deep crevice is a fissure. So if you see something called a fissure, we're talking about a very, very deep sulcus. We're going to start by looking at the cerebrum, because the cerebrum is the majority of the brain in humans. It's about 83% of the brain's mass. And this is where all of our conscious thought and problem solving occurs. There are 5 lobes in the cerebrum. Sometimes you'll only see 4 mentioned, but there are actually 5. So here we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and then deep within, kind of in this area right here, is a lobe called the insula. So you would actually have to kind of reflect the temporal lobe and the frontal and parietal lobes in order to see the insula. The gray matter that's found on the outside of the cerebrum forms what's called the cerebral cortex. And again, this is where we find cell bodies and very short unmyelinated neurons. And this is where motor information, sensory information, and our kind of understanding of different stimuli happens. Something that's interesting about the cerebral cortex is that what's on one side, so if we're looking at the left hemisphere over here and the right hemisphere over here, it's not a mirror image. So there's areas over here that say deal with language, and if you look at the same area on the other side, it's going to deal with something else. That is called lateralization. So there's not a duplication of the right and left hemispheres. There's lateralization. Certain functions happen on one side or the other. The other thing that is interesting about the cerebral cortex is that there's contralateral control. And so that means that information that's coming in from the right side of the body goes to the left side of the brain, and information that's coming in from the left side of the body goes to the right side of the brain. We're going to spend some time looking at what happens in each of the lobes. We're going to start with the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is where kind of our planning happens, where higher order thinking happens, and is also where the majority of our motor centers are. So in lab, we talk about this central sulcus. And in front of the central sulcus, there is a pretty major gyrus. And there's also another one posterior to the central sulcus. The one that is anterior is called the primary motor cortex. So whenever we hear motor, we know that it's about movement. And so this is the primary motor cortex, where the primary kind of signals come out about movement. In front of that is the premotor cortex. Okay, and so that's kind of smoothing out those movements. When we look at the parietal lobe, we see that this area is primarily concerned with sensory information. So behind that central sulcus, we have the somatosensory cortex. And so this is going to be getting information that's been relayed by a part called the thalamus to different parts of the somatosensory cortex. There's also the somatosensory association area. And so the primary somatosensory cortex is where the information comes in. And then when we see association regions or cortices, we're talking about understanding what that information is. Okay, so there's usually one area where the information comes in, and then there's another area where that information is made sense of. So the parietal lobe is going to process information about proprioception, and proprioception is kind of where our joints are in space, pain, taste, touch, and temperature. When we're talking about the primary somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex, one thing that's really helpful for people to see is what's called the cortical homunculus. It's a little bit tough of a word to say, cortical homunculus. And so what the cortical homunculus is just a way of representing how different parts of the body map onto the brain. And we're looking, at those primary cortices right now. And so here are these sculptures. I love these sculptures. So this is a sensory model, and this is a motor model. And the size of the different parts on the sculpture represent how much of the brain is dedicated to those regions. So look at how much sensory space is taken up by the hands, and motor space, it's even more. The mouth area as well takes up a very large amount of space. Okay, but then we look at the arms, the trunks, and the legs, and it's a very small amount of space. Okay, this is showing us that the sensory information that's coming in from our face, particularly around our mouth, and our hands is really, really important, and there's a huge amount of information coming in. But areas like our arms, our trunk, and our legs, where there's less information coming in, get less space on these cortices. So this is, again, the kind of model way of describing this. And this is the illustration. And so we're just looking at the left hemisphere here. And this is the sensory homunculus. So this is showing us how much of the brain is dedicated to different parts for sensory, for taking in sensory information. So the tongue and mouth, nose, and eyes, all down here, have a very large part of the brain. The hand and fingers also have a very large part of the brain. But look at this. Compare the arm to the hand and fingers, right? It's less than half of the brain dedicated to the hand and fingers was dedicated to the arm. And so now we have the shoulder, head, neck, and trunk. And that's about the same amount of brain that's dedicated, again, to either the face or to the hand and fingers. Here we have the hip and the leg, foot, toes, and genitals. So I think that either this illustration or this model is really helpful in understanding how much of the brain is dedicated to processing information or sending information out to different parts of the body. The temporal lobes, which are located right in the ear area on both sides of our brain, deal with processing auditory information, deal a little bit with processing visual stimuli, and are involved in object and language recognition. The last of the exterior lobes is the occipital lobe, and it's found right back here. And this is going to be dealing primarily with visual information, visual processing. And that lobe that I talked about that's not identified in this picture, that's deep to the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe, called the insula, This lobe we know is involved in emotion, addiction, decision making, and taste. In fact, part of this lobe forms what's called the gustatory cortex. Gustatory is, what something tastes like. All these different lobes have to be able to communicate with each other. And so the communication happens between axons, just like all neuronal communication happens. And these axons are going to kind of go across hemispheres and between hemispheres. And so there's a different name for each type of communication. If we're looking at fibers that are horizontal in the same hemisphere, they're called association fibers. If we're looking at fibers that communicate horizontally across different hemespheres, they're called commissural fibers. And if we're looking at fibers that send information vertically, either from the cerebral cortex to the lower brain, or from the brain to the spinal cord, they're called projection fibers. So let me just draw that out for you, or indicate that for you. So if we're looking at information traveling this way, it's going to be an association fiber. Okay, it's all staying in the same hemisphere. If information's traveling this way, it's called a commissural fiber, because the information's going in different hemispheres. And if the information is traveling from the superior to the inferior portions of the brain, they are called projection fibers.